Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Lavaria. Today, we're going to step away from the UFO subject and talk about something I'm developing on my own, something I call Katoon theory or K theory. It's not totally original, like most things on the planet. My three inspirations are a book by Michael Coe called Reading the Maya Glyphs, The Event by Slavoj Zizek, and The Fourth Turning. Um, so let's get into it, and I'll explain, how this came about in the process. Um, so basically, what is an event, right? Whether we're talking about historical events or kind of current events, how do we understand the event, right? So according to Slavoj Zizek, he says the following: This is an event at its purest and most minimal, something shocking, out of joint that appears to happen all of a sudden and interrupts the usual flow of things, something that emerges seemingly out of nowhere without discernible causes, an appearance without solid being as its foundation. There is, by definition, something miraculous in an event, from the miracles of our daily lives to those of the most sublime spheres, including that of the divine. The eventual nature of Christianity arises from the fact that to be a Christian requires a belief in a singular event, the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, keep in mind that Slavoj Zizek is an atheist and a communist. Okay, so he's not promoting Christianity for those who might be offended by that. Um, but what he's saying is that to be a Christian means you have to believe something, especially during the first century, which was again sudden, that interrupts the usual flow of things and ideas, something that comes out of nowhere, right? If you look in Judaism, in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, there are people that die and come back to life, okay, and then they die again eventually, right? You also have people that get taken up into heaven, like Elijah, right? But nowhere in the Tanakh does someone die, come back to life, and then go back into heaven, right? Let alone the Messiah. So, the whatever happened on Easter Sunday, right? That first generation of Christians headquartered in Jerusalem after the crucifixion, we're describing something that again had no discernible causes, you know, uh, an appearance without solid being, um, as as its foundation, something that appeared to happen suddenly, um, and out of nowhere, right? Kind of like a magic trick, right? If you don't know how the magician pulls the rabbit out of the hat, it and you see it happen, especially a magic trick you've never seen before, it's really very impressive. So that's what Slavoj Zizek is talking about in terms of an event, right? So I'll give you few examples of what an event looks like, right? Um, 9/11, okay. 9/11, I'm 45 years old, so, I was 20, 21 when it happened. It came out of nowhere, right? It just literally one day, you know, two planes crash into the Twin Towers, one crashes into the Pentagon, one crashes into a field. It came out of nowhere, right? It was an event. It interrupted the flow of things, right? 10/7, right? The Hamas attack on the different kibbutzes, those communes in Israel, and also the concert, the music festival that was happening. Again, just out of nowhere, uh, interrupted the flow of things. Shocking, um, miraculous. In both of these events, in the sense that a seemingly uh, less competent and inferior force, right, uh, was able to pull this off. Like, how did they pull it off? How did we not see this coming, right? COVID and the resultant lockdowns, right? The whole mass culture, social distance and all that kind of stuff, vaccines and vaccine mandates, all that stuff just kind of came out of nowhere, even though there were movies about it, those are movies. People don't really expect that to happen within their lifetime. And when it did, it just happened out of the blue, without discernible causes, right? Because, even though logic would have told you the Wuhan lab had something to do with it, we were fed other lies. about, wet markets and that sort of thing, or people eating bats, whatever. So, those are three examples of events in the philosophical sense that Slavoj Zizek is describing here. Something that without discernible causes, at least immediately, and at least for people who aren't willing to think outside the box or think a little differently. And so this is what this episode is about. I'm going to proffer a model for understanding events, both in history and in real time when they happen, so that we can have some more independent thought, which is very hard to do in a world of mainstream media and alternative media, or what I call the counter media. Um, but anyways, so I want to approach the event um, as happening within kind of like cause and effect type of rubric, right? In the rubric of cause and effect. Okay? And I want to see the event as the effect of a cause, right? Because Slavoj Zizek talks about no discernible causes, but that means there are causes. They're just not immediately discernible at the time. And just like any magic trick, right? There is a cause. There's an explanation for how the magician takes the rabbit out of the hat. I'm going to use 20-year blocks um, for several reasons. Um, and first of all, purely aesthetic reasons. Okay, I love the Maya. Um, the Maya are a fascination to me. And there was a phase in my life where I was trying to teach myself classical Maya, and this was one of my textbooks, right? The Maya had a base 20 system of math. We have a base 10 system of math. So, 10 years is a decade, 10 decades is a century, 10 centuries is a millennium. The Maya had actually four concurrently functioning counts of time. There was the long count, there was the Hab, there was the Tzolk'in, and there was the lunar count, right? So the long count is what you see on your screen. It's a 360-day year. The Hab was a 365-day year. The Tzolk'in was a 9-month cycle. Okay. Uh, Coincidentally, the same time it takes to gestate a baby, right? Not coincidentally. And then you had the lunar cycle. Now, what's interesting about the long count is that, again, base 20 system. So you have a day, 20 days make a month. Okay, called Winal in classical Mayan. Winal is the word for month. It's also the word for man, right? Because human beings have 20 fingers and toes, right? So there's a little bit of microcosm, macrocosm going on there, something that appears in cultures all over the world. Jungian archetypes, collective unconscious. So, you have 20 days make a Winal, which is a 20-day month. But then you have a year, a 360-day year. But then 20 years make a Katun, and 20 Katuns make a Baktun, right? So this isn't strange or magical, right? They have a base 20 system. So rather than look at time in terms of decades, they look at it in terms of score, right? The score is a 20-year cycle. Abraham Lincoln, four score and 20 years ago, our forefathers, blah, blah, blah. So that's interesting. And I just have to say before I go forward, the Maya never said the world was going to end in 2012. That's some new age internet claptrap BS that gets parroted because we like to humiliate non-Western cultures that were dominated, by the West. Uh, they never predicted the end of the world 2012. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the stone monuments, and also I think the Dresden Codex, they talk about a date, a specific date for the beginning, right? However, there are monuments. I'm thinking of the hieroglyphic staircase in Tikal, for one, where they mention events happening millions of years before that creation date. And we're talking, and when I talk about events, I'm talking about ball games, talking about sacrifices. I'm talking about, different kind of royal events and all that sort of thing. How is that possible? Well, it's because the Maya didn't have a view of time that was linear. Okay. They didn't have a beginning and an end in a straight line like Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Zoroastrians do. No, they had a cyclical view of time, and their calendar system was cyclical, it was a set of interlocking cycles. Okay. And so there were many, many, many beginnings and many, many, many endings, okay, of their calendar. Right? And that grand cycle, the ultimate big cycle of the Maya calendar, right? It starts about 5,000 years ago, and then it ends at 2012. But what happens next? Nothing. Only the calendar starts again. Okay, and so the Maya, both the living Maya and the ancient Maya, okay, that's a new beginning. Okay, but it's not an end of the world like they show in the movies. That's just nonsense. Okay, so I just wanted to say that because everyone likes to say the Mayans got it wrong. It's like, no, they didn't. They didn't even make the claim you're making. So, anyways, 20-year cycles. Okay, so that's my aesthetic kind of like preference. However, it also makes sense in the sense that that's basic human generation, right? Every single culture on the planet agrees that by 20 years you're an adult. Okay, so the age of adulthood might be 16 in some cultures, 18 in other cultures, or 20 years, such as Japan, where I live. Okay, so it's really cool how at the beginning of the year they have a coming of age day where all the 20-year-olds they go meet at the city hall, right? The girls wear these beautiful kimonos, the guys just wear suits. And they have a ceremony and they take pictures, and it's a really beautiful sight. But so in Japan, you're a full-fledged adult when you're 20 years old. And every culture agrees that by 20 you're an adult. Okay, but that's also the amount of time you need to go from not just the zygote to an adult, but from the end of a catastrophic war where your population declines to generating a new batch of soldiers to fight the next catastrophic war, right? So that's also a generation, time you need to create a new batch of soldiers. And about 26, 27 is the current median age of first time motherhood, right? In some parts of the world, like sub Saharan Africa and let's say the Middle East, that median age of motherhood might be in the late teens, right? Half the women having their first child before age 20 and half after. In some parts of the world, like South Korea, Japan, that median age it may be pushed up to the early 30s, right? Half the women having their first child after 30, half of them having it before age 30. But you know, 20 years, right? If we're talking about an event, 20 years later, you have a new batch of adults, okay, that can now participate in the world who won't remember the world before the event. Okay. And also, that's why I think to really understand an event, you have to go 20 years before this. Why? Because I think, as I'll show here, events are like people in the sense that they take 20 years to percolate. Okay. It's between the time that seed is planted to when the tree actually grows. Okay. And I'm going to give you some examples of how this is. First of all, let's look at 9/11. Here's a very pivotal event for Gen Y, Gen X. Um, Again, the youngest cohorts who remember the world before 9/11. Um, and to understand 9/11, in my view, you simply have to go 20 years in the past, right? To begin to understand it. And what happened 20 years before 9/11? Well, you had the Russo-Afghan War. Okay. And basically, the Soviet Union was trying to control Afghanistan. Okay. And the Taliban and a bunch of other jihadist groups, I believe, like, excuse me, one Maoist group as well, um, kind of, revolted. They resisted. And what did the United States do? Well, The CIA helped the Mujahideen, right? We helped the Al Qaeda, okay? Um, in various ways that you can go look up on your own. But we helped Osama bin Laden and his friends uh, beat the Russians. Very indirectly, obviously, our help was, but we helped them beat the Russians. And so the Russians lost in Afghanistan. The Taliban took over the land. They became the government, and they provided a home for Al Qaeda to operate. And it was like a 10-year war. It was very bloody, very horrible. Um, but that was 20 years before 9/11. Okay. And, Al Qaeda, bin Laden specifically, is and was a hero in the Arab world. Why? Because he was, born into, multi-million dollar wealth. And rather than just stay in his silk pajamas, right, and give money to the Mujahideen, he gave up those silk sheets for life in a cave, right? And so he went in and participated in these battles as a commander. Okay, that's why they look at him as a hero. And what we didn't understand in the West is that Bin Laden wasn't just fighting communism; he was fighting modernity, right? Once fascism came and went in World War II, um, the two big harbingers of modernity left in the world were liberalism and communism, right? And the Soviet Union was a champion of communism, and the United States was a champion of liberalism. And Soviets tried to take over, try to control Afghanistan. The Mujahideen resisted, and coincidentally, not that long after the Soviets lost, the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And suddenly you had these republics, these ethnically based republics breaking off, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, you name it, the Ukraine, right? So, the loss in Afghanistan was a blow to the Soviet Union, and so Bin Laden set his eye to the other champion of modernity, right? The one that had an opposing vision to that of the Soviets, but which was modern nonetheless. It was liberalism, right? And he attacked the financial center of the great champion of liberalism, New York City, right? So, if you want to understand the cause of 9/11, right, it's not just simply Al Qaeda, right? You have to go back. It's Al Qaeda during the Russo Afghan War, the Al Qaeda that we helped, prop up and train. And I'm not saying anything new here, okay? But what I like about this basic idea is that it gives us some kind of discipline where, because we understand uh, basic human generation from zygote to adult is 20 years, right? We can have a more objective cutoff point for looking at old history. I think there has to be a statute of limitations on old history to explain the present, right? And 20 years is a good one because all the different Al Qaeda fighters, the Mujahideen who died in Afghanistan during the Russo Afghan War, they're dead and they have to be replaced. And it's going to take roughly 20 years to replace them. Okay. And so we have the new batch of the Mujahideen, the new batch of terrorists, if you will, just in time for 9/11. Okay. And so I think that's important to understand. But there's a sense in which the event itself becomes a cause to another, not just to another event, but to an effect, right? So the event has a cause, but the event is also a cause to an effect, right? So if we really want to understand 9/11, we don't just look at the cause, we look at the effect. And we can't really understand the effect until, again, 20 years later. Why? Because not only do you have a new generation of adults who don't remember the world before 9/11, but let's say in the democracies, right? Recent college graduates, who are having entry level positions into the adult workaday world, be they private sector or public sector, 20 years later, now they're in middle management, right? And whoever was in middle management during the 9/11, 20 years later, they're executives, right? And whoever was an executive during 9/11, right, be it in government or in the private sector, they're not at working anymore 20 years after 9/11, right? So you really have, in some sense, a different world 20 years after the event, both in terms of adults in the democracies who can vote, who don't remember the world before 9/11, right? Before the event, fighters who can fight, who don't remember the world before the event, but also adult leaders who were formed and forged in the wake of the event, right? So maybe they remember the world before the event, but they grew as leaders in the wake of the event and are inspired by the event, had their world view is shaped by the event in some sense. So if we look 20 years after 9/11, and notice I'm focusing here on Afghanistan, okay, I'm not arguing for some butterfly effect. Like, no, we have to have a spatial discipline as well. If we look 20 years after 9/11, what do we have? 20 years after 9/11, the United States withdraws from Afghanistan overnight without any warning, right? And then the puppet government that we had propped up in Afghanistan, right, with their military that we had trained, $7 billion worth of equipment that we had left there. Um, they just go belly up, and when the Taliban comes out of the mountains, they don't resist, right? And it's understandable. Okay, they did not want what we offered. Okay, they did not want a system of government or that resembles our own, right? They don't have the same history as we do, right? They want Islamism. Okay, that's why they didn't revolt against the Taliban. They didn't resist them, right? So that's what happened. And so here we are. The Taliban is in power in Afghanistan, and they can rightfully say that they survived two wars, one with the Soviet Union and one with the United States, arguably the two greatest powers, right, of the world back in the 80s, right? Who would have thought? Um, and so if you really want to understand 9/11, that's how you do it. Look 20 years after, look 20 years before. Okay. And so what can we say? What caused 9/11? Well, the 9/11 was caused by Mujahideen, right, by Al Qaeda, who we had supported and nurtured and trained uh, and assisted during the Russo-Afghan War. Okay, once they had defeated the Soviets, right? Because the Soviets came, they lost, and the Soviet Union fell shortly thereafter. They turned their sights on the United States. They did 9/11, and what did that do? That drew in the United States into Afghanistan, where we had a war again with the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And, 20 years later, we leave, and the Taliban come back into power, and they're not going to leave anytime soon. For the foreseeable future, they're they are ensconced in Afghanistan. They are it. And so that's what 9/11 is. It drew the United States into a war in Afghanistan, which we arguably lost, right? If you look at defeat in terms of not achieving our geopolitical aims. And the Taliban survived it, and they're still in power. So, you know, I hate to say it, the mission accomplished, right? On their, from their side of the fence. I'm an American. I love my country. I'm pro America, Team America, no matter who we're fighting, because that's just how I am. I love my American people, even though I don't live anywhere near them. I live in Japan. But, look, I'm not saying this as a pro Al Qaeda video, but this is what it is. If you want to understand 9/11, we know what caused it, and we know what the effect was. And it, basically it cemented the Taliban's power in Afghanistan, period. Okay. They drew us in, they won from a certain point of view, and that's all there is to it. So that's 9/11, according to my model. Um, But what about more recent events, right? Well, one thing I like about this model is that it reminds us to have some kind of epistemic humility. Okay. And it reminds us that in the immediate wake of the event, we cannot understand it fully. Okay. Why? Because we're being propagandized. Okay. Let's take the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think if you want to understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to go back 20 years. Not 40 years, not 80 years, back to World War II, not back to the Kievan Rus. Okay. You only have to go back 20 years, right? Ukraine is out of the Soviet Union by the 90s. And, you know, 20 years ago, in what is it, 2012, uh, they, not 2020, not in 2012, I'm sorry, 2002, 20 years ago in 2002, they signaled for the first time publicly and openly that they were interested in joining NATO. So this thing called the NATO Ukraine Action Plan was developed. If you are a Russian leader, I don't care who you are, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO is totally unacceptable for several reasons, right? Let's just go strategically, right? There's a space called the Volgograd Gap. Okay, the city of Volgograd or Stalingrad, depending on what you name it. Uh, it sits on that flat piece of land that basically connects Russia to the Caucasus. And it's this piece of land straddles Russia, Caucasus, right? So it's territory, it's republics like Dagestan, Chechnya, and then it also straddles the eastern part of Ukraine and the Caspian Sea, if I'm not mistaken. And that piece of land is strategic, right? And you cannot afford to have American troops in Ukraine that close to the Volgograd Gap, because if there was ever war, all those troops have to do is invade Stalingrad slash Volgograd and take over that strip of land. And then now they've cut off Russia from the Caspian, the Caucasus, and then they have a straight shot, from south to north up into Moscow, which is why Hitler attacked that piece of land first before he ever attacked Moscow, because it is so strategic, right? So, that was the seed in 2002, this NATO Ukraine action plan that began this sequence of events that gradually led up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Okay. Now, I don't think we can fully understand this until 20 years after the fact. Why? Because we're being propagandized by the mainstream media in the West and the Russian media in the East, whether that be through RT, whether that be through different internet, celebrities who are paid by Moscow, by the intelligence service, whatever, to say whatever they got to say in social media to make Russia look like the good guys. Um, we're being propagandized. Okay, we have the mainstream media, and then we have the counter media. We have the mainstream propaganda, and then we have the counter propaganda, right? And our opinion about that event is totally dependent on who we identify with, right? If you identify with the Ukrainians, you're gonna shake your fist at Putin. If you identify with the Russians, you're gonna shake your fist at NATO. Um, but I don't, again, to understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to go back, I believe, to the NATO Ukraine action plan because it just fits hand in glove, right? That's the issue. Ukraine's joining NATO. Okay. And that's why I don't think you can fully understand that current war, specifically the invasion that started the war, until 20 years after the fact. Once all the propaganda has died down, once we have a clear winner, right? Um, Only then will we truly be able to understand that event um, after we see the effects. So in this model, you have the event, which is like a tree, with the trunk of the tree, okay, the stem of the plant, okay. The cause is the seed or the roots, and then the effect is fruit. And until you see the fruits, you can't really say anything definitive about it. Okay. And I feel that same way about 10/7. Okay. To understand 10/7, which was the Hamas attack on Israel, on the different kibbutzim communities, upon, that big music festival and the horrible things they did, unmentionable things. You don't have to go back to the Nakba. You don't have to go back to the first Arab-Israeli war. You don't have to go back to World War II or talk about the Ottoman Empire. You don't have to talk about any of that. Okay. To understand that event, I think you only have to go back 20 years. And what happened 20 years ago in Gaza? Well, Israel pulled out of Gaza. Okay, the IDF pulled out. They stopped occupying that piece of land. And they also shut down the settlements, right? You had a bunch of Jewish settlers in Gaza, just like you do now in the West Bank, right? And Israel forced them to leave that land. And as the settlers and IDF left, the Gazans had an election and Hamas won the election, right? And then they didn't have an election ever since, right? And so that was the seed. Okay, that was the conception. Okay, that was the birth. Okay, that was the beginning of something that grew and culminated into the event that we call October 7th. Now, what are the effects? I don't know, and nobody else really knows. Okay, to really understand October 7th, we need to know the effects, and we won't see those effects till 20 years later. Okay. Once you have a new group of Palestinians, right? Wherever the Palestinians are now demographically, any small child or baby born today that, you know, grows to maturity 20 years from now, okay, they're not going to remember the world before 10/7. Okay. Ditto for any Israelis, right? And again, not just the children. We're talking about young adults. We're talking about middle management. We're talking about executives. Okay, the world's going to look very different 20 years from now. What's it going to look like, right? Are the Israelis going to take over Gaza, right? Are they going to annex it? Are they going to put settlements back in there? Are they going to turn it into a beach resort? Okay. Or is there going to be a Palestinian state, right? Will we have 20 years from now a free state of Palestine, right? With embassies in France and in the UK and Canada and Saudi and all these places. I don't know, right? But the answer to that question, okay, uh, is going to determine how we understand the event known as October 7th. Okay. That will define it. Okay. We already have a cause. But once we know the effect, only then will we really understand this event, right, in its totality. And so, even though I'm advocating for some kind of epistemic humility, uh, I am not advocating for any kind of moral agnosticism or any other kind of agnostic feeling, okay? Because we do have some understanding, or we can have if we have the right start point. If we can identify when the seed was planted, we can at least understand, what 66% of the event of this of this event, what it means, and what caused it, what's really going on. And again, I think to understand 10/7, you really have to understand first and foremost the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, both in terms of the IDF and the settlers, right? And Hamas's win in their general election, right? Once Hamas took over the government, that planted a seed that culminated in 10/7. Okay. And I understand that in putting forward this model, I'm doing something very anti-YouTube. Usually, you're supposed to take a very definitive stance, pick a side, and then make a million different predictions about the future because most of them will not come true. And then once one of those predictions comes true, you make another YouTube video that says, "Aha, I told you this would happen." I'm not doing that. What I'm simply trying to do is understand these events um, as dispassionately as I can, um, and as objectively as I can. Okay. And so that's the theory. That's K theory. I hope you like it. Okay. Again, this is predominantly a UFO show. So if we want to take it back to UFOs, you know, you can simply take something like the New York Times story in 2017, right? That basically said, yeah, the government does study UFOs secretly. There's a program called ATIP, and that kind of, you know, got the ball rolling into the modern UFO discourse. Okay, if you want to understand the import of that 2017 article from the New York Times, go back 20 years. And if you want to truly understand it, you have to understand its effect, and we won't really know until what, 2037? So yeah, that's it for today. That's K theory. I hope you like it. Um, let's have some epistemic humility, but let's not be agnostics either. Let's understand the weight of generations and how that impacts the world as zygotes grow to adults and come of age, as middle managers become executives and executives retire, um, how that all impacts things. And only 20 years later can we truly have a complete understanding of an event and its significance. But again, let's not be agnostic. Um, let's be objective. Let's just go back 20 years, um, which is seems to be the amount of time it takes for these things to percolate. And after we've done that, then you can take a side. Then you can take a side and have your very strong opinion and make your predictions. Because if we understand the causes of events, maybe if we want to prevent them from reoccurring, we can prevent ourselves from doing those causes again, right? We want these kinds of events to not reoccur. Maybe we need to stop doing the things that cause them. And with that, I bid you good night. And remember, your consciousness is not classified.